Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness. On a bitter winter night in downtown Chicago, widowed rideshare driver Noah Pierce discovers a woman in elegant evening wear shivering at an abandoned bus stop, her designer heels no match for the blizzard swirling around her. What starts as one father's instinct to help a stranger quickly transforms into something neither of them expected. Noah assumes Vivienne is just another person down on their luck, offering her the warmth of his modest apartment and his daughter, Lily's innocent chatter over hot cocoa. But Vivienne Hale is actually the reclusive billionaire heiress who walked away from a suffocating gala to experience one night of ordinary life. In the glow of Noah's humble home, surrounded by second-hand furniture and genuine laughter, Vivienne rediscovers what real wealth feels like. Yet when her security team tracks her down the next morning, the fairy tale shatters. Noah feels betrayed by her deception, while Vivienne realizes she's found the family she never knew she was searching for. Determined to bridge their worlds, Vivienne secretly launches a community initiative that could change everything for families like Noah's. But when tabloids paint him as a gold digger and corporate enemies threaten to destroy her plans, both must decide what they're willing to risk for love. Will Noah's simple act of compassion be enough to overcome the impossible divide between their worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a wounded animal through the narrow alleyways of Chicago's South Side, carrying with it the sharp bite of February and the promise of a long night ahead. Noah Pierce pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as he navigated his aging Honda Civic through the maze of snow-covered streets, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the relentless cascade of white that seemed determined to bury the city whole dot at 34. Noah carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to shoulder burdens without complaint. His hands, calloused from years of honest work, gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease as he squinted through the windshield. The radio crackled with weather warnings and traffic updates, but Noah had already made his decision one more. Fair, then home to Lily. The blizzard could rage all it wanted. He'd weathered worse storms than this. The rideshare app on his dashboard had been mercifully quiet for the past hour, most sensible folks having retreated to the warmth of their homes. Noah didn't blame them. If circumstances were different, he'd be curled up on his couch right now, helping 9-year-old Lily with her homework while something simple simmered on the stove. But circumstances were what they were, and the rent notice tucked behind his sun visor served as a constant reminder that survival required sacrifice. He was about to call it a night when he spotted her, a figure hunched against the wind at the bus stop on Ashland Avenue, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first glance, she looked like a mirage, or perhaps a trick of the storm. No bus had run this route in over an hour, and any reasonable person would have sought shelter long ago. But there she sat, on the metal bench that must have felt like ice through whatever thin fabric she wore, her dark hair whipping around her face like a banner of surrender. Noah slowed the car, his conscience warring with his practical mind. He'd picked up enough stranded passengers over the years to know that good Samaritans often found themselves taken advantage of. But something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself so still, as if movement might shatter what little composure she had left, tugged at something deeper than caution. He pulled over, hazard lights blinking their amber warning, into the storm. "Ma'am?" He called through the passenger window he'd rolled down just enough to be heard. "Are you all right?" She looked up, and Noah felt his breath catch. Even through the veil of snow and exhaustion, he could see that she was beautiful in the way that made a man forget his own name, high cheekbones carved from marble, eyes the color of storm clouds, skin that spoke of a life lived in comfort rather than struggle. But it was the vulnerability in her expression that made his decision for him. "The bus," she said, her voice carrying the refined cadence of someone accustomed to being heard the first time she spoke. "I've been waiting for the bus." "Bus stopped running an hour ago," Noah replied gently. "Where are you trying to get to?" She blinked at him, snowflakes clinging to her eyelashes like tiny stars. For a moment, she seemed to be searching for an answer to a question she hadn't expected. "I am not entirely sure." Noah studied her more carefully. The evening gown beneath her inadequate coat was exquisite, the kind of garment that probably cost more than he made in 3 months. Her jewelry, what little he could see of it, caught the streetlight with the unmistakable gleam of real stones. This was not a woman who typically found herself stranded at bus stops in Southside Chicago. "Look," he said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "You can't stay out here. You'll freeze to death before morning." He reached across to unlock the passenger door. "You're coming with me." She hesitated, and Noah could practically see the internal debate playing out behind her eyes. Stranger danger warred with necessity, and necessity won. "I don't have any money for a ride," she said as she slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp bite of winter air. "Didn't ask for any," Noah replied, cranking up the heat. "Where can I take you?" Another pause, longer this time. Could you just drive for a while?" "I need to think." Noah pulled back into traffic, such as it was. The city had transformed into something from a fairy tale, all harsh edges softened by snow and streetlights, creating pools of amber warmth in the darkness. "Mind if I ask what you were doing out there, dressed like that?" She looked down at herself, as if seeing the evening gown for the first time. "There was a function tonight." "Gala. I needed some air. Must have been quite a function to send you running into a blizzard." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You could say that." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of tires on snow and the steady rhythm of the wipers. Noah found himself stealing glances at his passenger, trying to piece together the story that had led her to that bus stop. Everything about her spoke of wealth and privilege, from the way she held herself to the quality of her clothes. Yet here she was, accepting a ride from a complete stranger rather than calling for help. "I should mention," Noah said as they turned onto his street, "I need to stop by my place for a minute. My daughter's with a neighbor, and I promised I'd be back by 9. "You have a daughter?" "Lily. She's 9, going on 30 if you ask her opinion on the matter." The warmth in his voice was unmistakable. Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn as her old man. And her mother? A question hung in the air between them, carrying weight Noah still wasn't sure he knew how to bear. "My wife Sarah passed away 3 years ago. Car accident." "I'm sorry," she said, and something in her tone suggested she understood loss in her own way. "Thank you. Lily and we figured out how to get along just fine on our own." Noah pulled into the parking space in front of a modest 3-story apartment building that had seen better decades. The brick facade was weathered but solid, and warm light glowed from windows where families were settling in for the night. It wasn't much, but it was home. "This is me," he said, then hesitated. "Look, I know we just met, but you can't go back out in this weather. Why don't you come up, warm up properly, and we can figure out where you need to be once the storm passes." She stared at the building, then at him, as if he just offered her something infinitely precious. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're cold, you're far from home, and you need help. That's enough for now." The apartment Mrs. Rodriguez opened to his knock was a symphony of controlled chaos toys neatly organized in bins. Homework spread across the kitchen table, and the lingering scent of something delicious that had been served for dinner. Lily looked up from where she'd been reading on the couch, her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, taking in the stranger behind her father with curious intelligence. "Dad, you're all snowy," she observed, climbing down from the couch with the unconscious grace of childhood. Blizzard out there, kiddo. This is, Noah realized he'd never gotten his passenger's name. Vivienne, the woman supplied quickly. My name is Vivienne. Miss Vivienne was stranded in the storm, Noah explained. I thought she could warm up here until it passes. Lily studied Vivienne with the frank assessment children excelled at, taking in the evening gown and elegant bearing with matter-of-fact acceptance. You look like a princess, she announced. But cold. Do you want some hot chocolate? Dad makes really good hot chocolate. For the first time since Noah had found her, Vivienne smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. I would love some hot chocolate. 20 minutes later, the three of them sat around Noah's small kitchen table, steaming mugs cradled in their hands while the storm raged outside. The apartment was small but clean, furnished with a mix of second-hand finds and pieces that spoke of careful budgeting rather than poverty. Everything had its place, and everything was well maintained. Vivienne found herself cataloging details she'd never noticed in any other home. The way Noah automatically cut Lily's sandwich into triangles, how Lily unconsciously leaned against her father when she laughed, the easy rhythm of their conversation that spoke of bedtime, stories and morning rituals, and 1,000 small intimacies that money couldn't buy. So what do you do, Miss Vivienne? Lily asked, her chin propped on her hands. I work for a foundation, Vivienne said carefully. We help people. That's nice. Dad helps people too. He drives them places when they need to go somewhere, and sometimes he helps carry groceries for Mrs. Rodriguez when her arthritis is bad. Noah flushed slightly. Lily, it's true. And last week, you helped Mr. Kim fix his car, and you didn't even charge him. That's very kind of your father, Vivienne said, and meant it. In her world, kindness often came with price tags and tax benefits. This was something different entirely. Dad says helping people is just what you do, not something special, but I think it's special. As the evening wore on, Vivienne found herself drawn into the simple rhythms of their life. Lily showed her the hand-drawn family portrait taped to the refrigerator, 2 figures in crayon, with a conspicuous empty space where a third might have stood. They played a board game that had clearly seen years of use, its edges soft with handling and half the pieces replaced with creative substitutes. When Lily finally yawned her way toward bedtime, Noah tucked her in with a practiced efficiency that spoke of countless nights of this same ritual. Vivienne could hear their voices through the thin walls, the low rumble of Noah reading a story, Lily's sleepy questions, and finally the soft sound of a kiss goodnight. She's wonderful, Vivienne said when Noah returned to the living room. She's my whole world, he replied simply, settling onto the couch beside her. I know this isn't much. He gestured around the small apartment, but we're happy here. Vivienne looked around again, seeing it through different eyes this time. The second-hand furniture wasn't shabby. It was loved. The small space wasn't cramped. It was cozy. The simple meal they'd shared wasn't plain. It was prepared with care and eaten with gratitude. It's perfect, she said, and realized she meant it. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the city. But inside Noah's small apartment, Vivienne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't calculating the political implications of every word, wasn't wondering what people wanted from her. She was simply Vivienne, drinking hot chocolate with a man who'd offered her shelter without asking for anything in return, listening to the soft sounds of a child, sleeping safely in the next room. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely impossible, and she never wanted it to end. Morning arrived with the peculiar hush that follows a heavy snowfall. The world outside transformed into something pristine and unfamiliar. Vivienne woke on Noah's couch to the sound of gentle movement in the kitchen and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. For a moment she lay still, listening to the domestic symphony she'd never experienced, the quiet clink of dishes, The soft murmur of father and daughter preparing for their day. The comfortable rhythm of a family that had learned to depend on each other. "Good morning, Miss Vivienne." Lily's voice carried the particular brightness of a child who'd slept well and woken to find the world covered in snow. Dad made pancakes. Vivienne sat up, acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her wrinkled evening gown, her carefully styled hair now a cascade of waves around her shoulders. In the harsh light of morning, the fantasy of the previous night seemed fragile, likely to shatter at the first touch of reality. "That's very kind," she said, accepting the plate Noah offered with a shy smile. The pancakes were perfectly golden, served with butter that had been carefully rationed and syrup that spoke of generic brands rather than gourmet indulgences. They were also the most delicious thing she'd tasted in years. "The roads are mostly clear," Noah said, settling at the table with his own modest portion. "I can drive you wherever you need to go once Lily's off to school." The simple offer hit Vivienne like a physical blow. Of course, this interlude was ending, as it had to. She would return to her penthouse, her boardrooms, her carefully orchestrated life of charitable galas and strategic philanthropy. The thought made her stomach clench with something that might have been panic. "I should call a cab," she said weakly. "Nonsense," Noah replied. "It's no trouble." Lily finished her breakfast with the efficiency of a child accustomed to morning routines, gathering her backpack and lunch with practiced movements. As she headed toward the door, she paused by the small coat closet, bending to retrieve something from the floor. "Miss Vivienne, you dropped this," she said, holding up a diamond earring that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant fragments across the modest living room. The silence that followed was deafening. Vivienne stared at the earring, as if it were a snake that might strike, while Noah's expression shifted from confusion to something more complex. The earring was clearly worth more than everything in his apartment combined, possibly more than he made in a year. That's not mine," Vivienne said quickly, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. It must have been there already. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see Noah's mind working, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. The expensive gown, the cultured accent, the way she'd hesitated when he asked where she lived, details that had seemed merely curious. The night before now took on a different significance. Lily, bless her innocent heart, looked between them with confusion. "But it fell out of your coat pocket when I hung it up last night. I saw it." "Lily, honey, go get your snow boots on," Noah said quietly, his eyes never leaving Vivienne's face. "Mrs. Rodriguez is going to walk you to school this morning." After Lily left with their neighbor, the apartment felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken questions. Noah sat back down at the table, the earring between them, like evidence in a trial neither of them wanted to have. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Vivienne felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could tell him the truth that she was Vivienne Hale, heir to one of Chicago's largest charitable foundations, that she'd fled last night's gala because she couldn't stand another minute of empty conversations and calculated philanthropy, that she'd been pretending to be someone else because for once in her life she wanted to be valued for herself rather than her bank account. Instead, she heard herself say, "It's costume jewelry, very good costume jewelry, but still fake." The lie hung between them like a physical thing, ugly and necessary. Noah picked up the earring, weighing it in his palm with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to distinguish between what was real and what was pretense. "This isn't costume," he said finally. "This is the real thing. You're imagining things. I may not have money, Vivienne, but I'm not stupid." His voice carried a hurt that cut deeper than anger would have. "I grew up in pawn shops with my grandfather. I know real diamonds when I see them." Vivienne's phone chose that moment to ring, the sound unnaturally loud in the small space. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, her assistant, probably frantic by now. She'd been missing for 12 hours without a word, something that simply didn't happen in her carefully managed world. She declined the call, but the damage was done. Noah had seen the expensive phone, the designer case, the look of panic that crossed her face at the prospect of answering. "Who are you really?" he asked quietly. "I'm exactly who I said I was." "No, you're not." Noah stood, moving to the window where he could look out at the street below. "Everything about you screams money. The way you hold yourself, the way you speak, that dress that probably costs more than my car. And now this earring." He turned back to her, and she could see the walls going up behind his eyes, the careful distance of a man who'd learned that people with money often treated people without it as entertainment or charity cases. "So what is this?" "You slumming." "It for a night? Seeing how the other half lives?" "No," Vivienne said quickly, rising from her chair. "It's not like that at all." "Then what is it like?" "Because I'm having trouble coming up with an innocent explanation for why someone who can afford jewelry like this was sitting at a bus stop in a blizzard." Vivienne felt the story she'd been building crumbling around her. Each lie led to another, and she could see Noah pulling back with every evasion. But the truth seemed impossible. How could she explain a world he'd never touched, responsibilities he'd never imagined, a loneliness so profound that she'd been willing to risk everything for one night of genuine human connection? "I can't," she whispered. "I can't explain. Can't or won't." The question hit its mark. Noah was right. She was choosing not to tell him, choosing to protect herself and her carefully constructed anonymity rather than trust him with the truth. But the truth felt too big, too complicated, too likely to change everything between them. "I should go," she said instead. "Yeah," Noah agreed, but his voice was sad rather than angry. "I think you should." As Vivienne gathered her things, she felt the magic of the previous night slipping away like sand through her fingers. The coat Noah had given her smelled like his cologne and Lily's strawberry shampoo, a combination that would haunt her for weeks to come. The snow globe Lily had given her as a welcome gift sat on the coffee table, its miniature world contained and perfect, an utterly fragile dot at the door. She turned back to find Noah watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said, "for last night, for helping me." "Just be careful out there," he replied. "The world's not as safe as you might think." If only he knew, Vivienne thought as she stepped out into the bright morning light. If only he knew that the real danger wasn't in the storm-swept streets of the city, but in the perfectly climate-controlled boardrooms where she spent her days, surrounded by people who smiled and nodded and saw her only as a signature on charitable checks. As Noah's apartment building disappeared behind her in the cab she'd finally called, Vivienne clutched the diamond earring in her palm until its edges bit into her skin. Such a small thing to destroy something so precious. But then again, in her experience, it was always the small things that mattered most. A child's innocent question, a man's quiet kindness, the space left empty in a hand-drawn family portrait. She'd found something real in Noah's modest apartment, something she'd been searching for her entire privileged life, without even knowing what she was looking for. And now, because of her own cowardice, it was gone. The cab carried her back toward her penthouse, toward her scheduled life, toward everything she'd been running from the night before. But she carried with her the memory of hot chocolate and board games, of a man who'd offered shelter without asking for anything in return, of a little girl who'd seen a princess where everyone else saw an obligation, and for the first time in her life, Vivienne Hale understood exactly what she was, losing. 3 days passed like a slow hemorrhage, each hour stretching endlessly as Vivienne found herself unable to concentrate on anything that had once seemed important. Board meetings blurred together in a haze of quarterly reports and strategic initiatives that felt suddenly meaningless. She sat in her glass-walled corner office 40 floors above the city, staring down at the streets where real life happened while she floated in her climate-controlled bubble of inherited responsibility. Marcus had stopped asking about her disappearance after the first day, when her sharp responses made it clear the topic was off limits. But she could see the concern in his eyes, the careful way he watched her for signs of whatever breakdown had sent Chicago's most reclusive billionaire wandering the streets in a blizzard. She told herself it was over. That brief interlude in Noah's apartment had been exactly what she'd thought she wanted, a glimpse into authentic life that she could carry back to her real world like a souvenir. But the memory refused to be filed away so neatly. Instead, it had taken up residence in the center of her chest, a constant ache that made everything else feel hollow by comparison. Meanwhile, across the city, in a neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' names and children played in hallways that smelled like cooking and lived in comfort, Noah Pierce was facing his own reckoning. He discovered the rent notice when he returned from dropping Lily at school, the bright yellow paper taped to his door like a neon accusation. 60 days behind, it proclaimed in official language that managed to be both polite and threatening. Pay or face eviction proceedings. Contact the management office immediately to discuss payment arrangements. Noah crumpled the paper in his fist, then smoothed it out again and read it twice more, as if the words might change on subsequent viewing. They didn't. The math was still the same: 3 months of reduced rideshare income due to car repairs, 2 missed warehouse shifts when Lily had been sick with flu, and the gradual erosion of financial stability that he'd been fighting against. For the better part of a year, he'd been managing, barely, walking the tightrope between disaster and survival with the practiced balance of a man who'd learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the blizzard had cost him 2 nights of driving, and those 2 nights might have been the difference between making rent and facing the possibility of homelessness with a 9-year-old daughter depending on him. "Dad?" Lily's voice carried from the kitchen when he came inside, carefully folding the notice and sliding it into his wallet, where it wouldn't be a constant reminder of how close to the edge they were living. "Mrs. Rodriguez made extra empanadas. She wants to know if we want some for lunch." "That sounds great, kiddo," Noah called back, forcing his voice to remain steady. Mrs. Rodriguez, bless her, had been making extra food with suspicious frequency lately, and Noah suspected she knew more about their financial situation than she let on. The thought should have been embarrassing, but instead it filled him with the kind of gratitude that made his throat tight. At lunch, as they shared Mrs. Rodriguez's empanadas and Lily chattered about her day at school, the conversation inevitably turned to the mysterious woman who'd spent the night on their couch. "Is Miss Vivienne coming back?" Lily asked, swinging her legs from her chair in the unconscious rhythm of childhood. "She left her snow globe?" Noah glanced at the small glass elm sitting on their windowsill, catching the afternoon light and throwing tiny rainbows across the kitchen wall. Lily had given it to Vivienne as a welcome gift, pulling it from her small collection with the generous impulse of a child who understood that sharing made everything better. "I don't think so, honey," Noah said carefully. "She was just here for the storm, but she liked us," Lily insisted with the confident logic of someone too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships. "I could tell, and we liked her too, didn't we?" They had, Noah realized. Despite the questions and the obvious deception, despite the diamond earring and the expensive clothes and the carefully constructed lies, he genuinely enjoyed Vivienne's company. There had been something real in her responses to Lily's chatter, something authentic in the way she'd settled into their evening routine as if she belonged there, which made the deception all the more painful. "Sometimes people come into our lives for just a little while," Noah explained, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "That doesn't mean they didn't matter. Like Mom?" The question hit him like a physical blow, unexpected and devastating in its simplicity. He looked at his daughter Sarah's eyes, Sarah's stubborn chin, Sarah's generous heart wrapped in a 9-year-old package, and felt the familiar twist of grief and love that had become the soundtrack to his life. "Yes," he said quietly. "Like Mom." But even as he said it, Noah knew the comparison wasn't quite right. Sarah's absence was a permanent loss, a hole in their lives that would never be completely filled. Vivienne's departure felt different, not like death, but like a door closing before he'd had the chance to see what was on the other side. That evening, after Lily was asleep and the apartment settled into its familiar quiet, Noah found himself researching the earring online. He told himself he was being paranoid, that there had to be a reasonable explanation for why someone would be carrying around what looked like tens of thousands of dollars in jewelry while claiming to be stranded, without money for a cab ride. But the more he searched, the more his suspicions crystallized into something approaching certainty. The style, the setting, the obvious quality of the stone. This wasn't the kind of jewelry someone owned by accident. This was the kind of jewelry that came with insurance policies and security guards, and the sort of wealth that treated Noah's annual income as pocket change. So who was Vivienne, really? And what had she been doing at that bus stop, dressed for a gala and running from something she couldn't or wouldn't name? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, picking at his growing conviction that their meeting hadn't been the random encounter it had seemed. People like Vivienne, whoever she really was, didn't just stumble into people like him. Their worlds didn't overlap except in carefully orchestrated charity events, where the wealthy could feel good about themselves by writing checks and attending tasteful fundraisers. Had she been slumming? The thought sat like a stone in his stomach. Had their evening been some sort of social experiment, a wealthy woman's adventure in seeing how the other half lived? Was that why she'd left so quickly, so eagerly, as soon as morning came and the spell broke? Noah stared at the snow globe on the windowsill, its miniature world contained and perfect, and utterly separate from the chaos of real life. Maybe that's all he'd been to Vivienne, a snow globe, a pretty scene to shake up and watch settle. Interesting for a moment, but ultimately disposable. The thought should have made him angry, but instead it just made him tired. Tired of struggling, tired of worrying about rent and grocery bills, and whether Lily would have to change schools if they got evicted. Tired of being the kind of person that others could use for entertainment and then discard without consequence. But as he prepared for bed, checking the locks and turning off the lights in their small, safe space, Noah couldn't quite shake the memory of how Vivienne had looked when Lily had shown her the family portrait. There had been something in her expression, a longing so profound, it had made his chest ache in recognition. Maybe he was wrong about her motivations. Maybe there was more to the story than he understood, or maybe he was just a fool, reading meaning into moments that had meant nothing to anyone but him. Either way, it didn't matter now. Vivienne was gone, back to whatever world had produced diamond earrings and designer gowns, and the kind of polished desperation that drove people into blizzards, rather than face another moment of their perfectly arranged lives. And Noah was exactly where he'd always been, trying to build something good and lasting from whatever materials he had at hand, one day at a time. By the end of the week, Vivienne had made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her reputation for careful deliberation and calculated moves. She checked into the Comfort Inn on Roosevelt Road, a modest hotel that she'd driven past 1,000 times without ever truly seeing. It was clean and functional, and utterly anonymous exactly what she needed while she figured out how to untangle the mess she'd made of her life. She told Marcus she was taking a few personal days, which was true enough, though she couldn't begin to explain what those personal days would entail. The foundation could run without her for a while. It had been doing so for generations before she'd inherited the responsibility, and her Uncle Charles would be more than happy to step in and make decisions in her absence. The hotel room was a study in beige mediocrity, generic furniture, generic art, generic bedding that smelled of industrial laundry detergent. It should have been depressing after a lifetime of luxury, but instead Vivienne found it oddly comforting. Here, she could be anyone or no one, invisible in the way she'd never been allowed to be. She spent hours walking the neighborhood, learning the rhythms of a world that existed entirely outside her experience. She watched children walk home from school, their backpacks bouncing and their voices carrying the particular cadence of freedom that came with the final bell. She sat in coffee shops where people argued about sports and complained about their bosses and planned weekend trips to places that didn't require private jets or security details. And every day, she found herself walking past Noah's building, never quite working up the courage to go inside, but unable to stay away entirely. Told herself she was just ensuring they were all right, that the blizzard hadn't caused any lasting problems. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. She missed them with an intensity that took her breath away. On Thursday evening, she was sitting on a bench across the street when she saw Noah emerge from the building, his shoulders set in the young, determined line of a man facing an unpleasant task. He walked 3 blocks to a check-cashing place that advertised payday loans in neon letters, and Vivienne's heart sank as she understood what she was witnessing. Financial desperation had a particular look to it, one she'd never experienced firsthand, but had learned to recognize in her charitable work. It was in the way Noah held himself as he entered the shop, the careful dignity of someone who'd exhausted other options, and was now turning to solutions that would only make things worse in the long run. 20 minutes later, he emerged with an envelope and the kind of expression that suggested he'd just signed away a piece of his future. Vivienne watched him walk home, and for the first time since she'd fled her penthouse, she felt the weight of her wealth as something more than privilege. Money, she realized, wasn't just about comfort or luxury. It was about choices, about not having to mortgage tomorrow to pay for today. That night, she sat in her generic hotel room and did something she'd never done before in her life. She researched Noah Pierce on the internet, using the investigative skills Marcus had taught her years ago for vetting potential business partners. What she found made her throat tight with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Obituary for Sarah Catherine Pierce, age 31, beloved wife and mother, survived by her husband Noah and daughter Lily. The article was brief, but painted a picture of a woman who'd been deeply loved, a teacher who'd volunteered at homeless shelters, who'd grown vegetables in a community garden, who'd believed in making the world better one small act at a time. There were photos from happier times. Noah and Sarah at what looked like a company picnic, both of them laughing as a much younger Lily sat on Sarah's shoulders. Wedding photos showing a young couple who looked at each other as if they'd discovered the secret to happiness. Family portraits that told the story of 3 years of building a life together before tragedy struck. Vivienne studied Noah's face. In those old photos, seeing the man she'd met, but also recognizing the differences. The laugh lines were the same, the gentle intelligence in his eyes unchanged, but there was a lightness in those earlier pictures that had been worn away by grief and responsibility and the daily struggle of single parenthood. She understood now why he still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck. She'd noticed it that night at dinner, a simple gold band that caught the light when he leaned forward to help Lily with her homework. He wasn't holding on to the past so much as honoring it, carrying Sarah's memory as a compass for the kind of man and father he wanted to continue being. The realization made Vivienne's deception feel even more shameful. Noah had opened his home to her in the aftermath of his own profound loss, had shared his family's warmth and security without asking for anything in return. And she'd repaid that generosity with lies and half-truths, then fled at the first sign of genuine intimacy. But more than shame, she felt a growing determination to find a way back into their lives, not as the mysterious stranger who'd needed shelter, but as someone who could offer the kind of security that Noah was clearly struggling to provide. The check-cashing place had been a warning sign. a red flag that spoke of desperation she was uniquely positioned to address. The question was how to do it without revealing her identity, without making Noah feel like a charity case or destroying the fragile trust she hoped might still exist between them. Her wealth was both a solution and a barrier, a tool that could fix the problems, but only if she could figure out how to use it without destroying everything that mattered. Friday morning found her standing outside Lincoln Elementary School at dismissal time, her heart hammering as she watched children stream out of the building in a chaos of backpacks and shouted goodbyes. She spotted Lily immediately. The same dark hair as her father, the same purposeful stride, but with an innocence that made Vivienne's chest ache with protective instinct. Lily saw her too, and her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that adults spent their whole lives trying to recapture. "Miss Vivienne," she called, breaking away from the group of children she'd been walking with. "You came back. I knew you would." "Hello, Lily," Vivienne said, kneeling down to the child's level. "How are you?" "I'm good. Dad's been sad, though. He thinks I don't notice, but I do. Are you coming home with me? We still have your snow globe. And Mrs. Rodriguez made cookies yesterday." The casual assumption that she would, of course, want to come home with them made Vivienne's throat tight. In Lily's world, people who mattered didn't just disappear. They came back. They stayed. They became part of the family constellation that kept everything stable and safe. "I'd like that very much," Vivienne heard herself say. "But maybe we should. Call your father first. Let him know I'm here. He's probably worried anyway," Lily said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned to read her parents' moods. "He always worries when I'm 5 minutes late." As they walked toward the apartment building, Lily chattering about her week at school and the book report she was working on, and the way the snow had melted to reveal the first green shoots of early spring, Vivienne felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about attraction to Noah, though that was certainly part of it. This was about belonging somewhere, about being needed not for her money or her connections, but for herself. It was about the terrifying possibility that she'd found her family in the most unlikely place imaginable. And this time, she wasn't going to run away. The following week fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Vivienne found herself spending every evening at Noah's apartment, arriving after Lily's school day ended and staying until bedtime stories were read and kitchen lights turned off. She helped with homework, participated in discussions about everything from dinosaurs to democracy, and learned to appreciate the particular satisfaction that came from making dinner with ingredients that had been carefully budgeted rather than carelessly abundant. Noah seemed to accept her presence with the same quiet grace he'd shown that first night, asking no questions about where she spent her days or why she'd returned with no explanation for her previous departure. But Vivienne could sense his confusion, the way he watched her sometimes as if trying to solve a puzzle that was missing crucial pieces. She was careful with her money, paying for groceries with cash and claiming the food was about to expire. Her job, bringing Lily small gifts that could plausibly have come from a thrift store rather than the boutiques she'd actually visited. Every lie was a small betrayal, but she told herself it was necessary, that the truth would destroy this fragile domestic peace she'd somehow stumbled into. It was while helping Noah with laundry that she made her first serious mistake. "You don't have to do that," Noah said, finding her folding clothes in the small laundry room shared by the building's residents. "You're not responsible for our mess." "I want to help," Vivienne replied, shaking out one of his work shirts with practiced efficiency. "Besides, many hands make light work, right?" She was reaching into the washing machine to retrieve the last few items when her fingers closed around something unexpected, a business card, sodden but still legible, that had clearly gone through the full wash cycle. The Hall Foundation logo stared up at her like an accusation, the elegant script proclaiming the organization she'd been running for the past 5 years. Noah appeared beside her before she could react. taking the card from her nerveless fingers and studying it with the focused attention she'd learned meant he was thinking through implications she hoped he wouldn't reach. Hale Foundation, he read aloud. That's one of the big charitable organizations downtown, isn't it? Ah, yes, Vivienne managed, her mind racing through possible explanations. I think so. Funny coincidence, finding this in your coat pocket. Noah said, his voice carefully neutral. Especially since you said you work for a foundation that helps people. The laundry room suddenly felt airless, the walls pressing in with the weight of her accumulated deceptions. Vivienne forced herself to meet Noah's eyes, seeing the questions there and the growing wariness of a man who'd been lied to before and learned to recognize the signs. I picked it up at a job fair, she said quickly. Last month. I was thinking about applying for a position there. It was a reasonable explanation, one that Noah clearly wanted to believe. But Vivienne could see him filing the information, away alongside the diamond earring and the expensive clothes and all the other details that didn't quite add up to the picture she'd been painting. The Hale Foundation, he repeated thoughtfully. They do good work. I've heard Vivienne Hale is pretty reclusive, though. Hardly ever seen in public. The irony was so sharp, it was almost funny. Here she was, the very person he was discussing, standing 2 feet away and lying about her own identity while he spoke about her reputation with the careful respect of someone who knew her only by her charitable works. I wouldn't know, Vivienne said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said in weeks. She didn't know herself anymore. Didn't recognize the woman who'd been content to sign checks and attend board meetings while staying carefully removed from the actual lives. Her money was supposed to be improving. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table working on Lily's math homework fractions, that Vivienne explained with the patient precision she'd once applied to foundation budgets, she caught Noah watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not suspicion, exactly, but something close to it. A recognition that the woman sitting at his table didn't quite match the story she'd been telling. Miss Vivienne, Lily said, interrupting her father's scrutiny, do you have a family? The question was innocent enough, the kind of thing children asked without understanding the complications it might unleash. But it hit Vivienne like a physical blow, forcing her to confront truths she'd been avoiding since she'd first stepped into their lives. She began, then stopped. How could she explain a family that existed only in boardrooms and trust funds, relationships maintained through lawyers and carefully orchestrated social events? How could she describe the isolation of being surrounded by people who saw her only as a signature on charitable donations? I have an uncle, she said finally, and some cousins. But we're not close. That's sad, Lily said with a matter-of-fact sympathy of childhood. Family should be close. That's what makes them family, right, Dad? Right, kiddo, Noah agreed, but his eyes remained on Vivienne with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. Family takes care of each other. Later, after Lily was asleep and they were washing dishes in the companionable silence that had become their evening routine, Noah finally asked the question Vivienne had been dreading. Are you in some kind of trouble? He said quietly, handing her a plate to dry. Because if you need help with something, I want you to know you can tell me. The kindness in his voice was almost unbearable. Here was this man who could barely afford his own rent, offering to help someone he suspected might be lying to him about fundamental aspects of her life. It was the kind of generosity that made Vivienne understand why Sarah had fallen in love with him, why Lily trusted him completely, why she herself was beginning to imagine a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. I'm not in trouble, she said, which was both true and completely false. She wasn't in physical danger, wasn't running from the law or an abusive relationship, but she was drowning in her own deceptions, trapped between the life she'd always known and the life she was beginning to realize she actually wanted. Good, Noah said, accepting her answer even though they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. Because I'd hate to see anything happen to you. Lily's gotten attached, and he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them. Lily had gotten attached, and so had he, and they were both vulnerable in ways that made Vivienne's deception feel less like self-protection and more like cruelty. That night, she walked back to her hotel room with the business card in her pocket, its edges still soft from the washing machine. Such a small thing to carry such weight, a simple piece of cardstock that connected her to a world Noah could never truly understand. A reminder of responsibilities and wealth and complications that would destroy the simple domestic happiness she'd found in his apartment. But as she prepared for bed in her anonymous hotel room, Vivienne found herself thinking not about the business card or the lies it represented, but about the way Lily had included her in the category of family, the way Noah had offered help without conditions, the way both of them had made space for her in their lives as if she'd always belonged there. For the first time in her privileged life, Vivienne Hale understood what it meant to have something worth fighting for. The question was whether she'd have the courage to fight for it. Saturday arrived with the particular sweetness of early spring in Chicago, the kind of day when winter's grip finally seemed to be loosening, and the city remembered what it meant to be alive. Lily had been planning their outing all week ice skating at Millennium Park, followed by hot chocolate and window shopping, though Vivienne suspected the 9-year-old's understanding of window shopping differed significantly from the traditional definition. "It's a perfect family day, Lily," announced over breakfast, the phrase so casual and matter-of-fact that Vivienne nearly choked on her coffee. Family day. As if the three of them had been doing this for years rather than weeks. As if there was nothing unusual about a mysterious woman who appeared and disappeared without explanation, becoming an integral part of their weekend routines. Noah caught her expression and offered a small, apologetic smile. "She's always been good at making people feel included," he said quietly. But the truth was, Vivienne didn't feel like she was being included out of politeness. She felt like she belonged, which was both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. As they prepared for their day out, she found herself moving through Noah's apartment with the easy familiarity of someone who knew where the extra mittens were kept and which of Lily's jackets would be warmest for ice skating. The ice rink at Millennium Park was crowded with families and couples enjoying the unseasonably mild weather. Vivienne watched Noah lace up Lily's skates with the practiced efficiency of a father who'd done this dozens of times, his large hands gentle as he checked the tightness and made sure everything was secure. "Do you know how to skate, Miss Vivienne?" Lily asked, bouncing slightly in anticipation. "It's been a while," Vivienne admitted, which was true. Her last time on ice had been at a private party in the Hamptons 3 years ago, complete with professional instructors and a rink that had been built specifically for the event. This public rink, with its scratched ice and rental skates that had seen better decades, felt refreshingly democratic. What followed was an hour of pure joy. Lily was fearless on the ice, darting between other skaters with the confidence of youth, while Noah followed at a more sedate pace, ready to catch her if she fell, but trusting her to find her own balance. Vivienne found herself somewhere between them, more cautious than Lily, but gradually relaxing into the rhythm of the ice, rediscovering muscles she'd forgotten she had. "You're really good," Noah said as they took a break at the edge of the rink, watching Lily attempt increasingly ambitious spins in the center. "Private lessons?" The question was casual, but Vivienne heard the undercurrent of curiosity. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit with her claimed background. She'd been making these small mistakes all week, unconsciously revealing knowledge or skills that suggested a very different upbringing than the one she'd implied. "My school had a good athletic program," she said, which was technically true. Her Swiss boarding school had indeed offered figure skating, along with equestrian training and tennis lessons, and all the other pursuits deemed appropriate for young women of her social class. After skating, they walked to a nearby cafe that Lily had specifically requested, a small, family-owned place that served hot chocolate in oversized mugs and didn't seem concerned with impressing anyone. Vivienne found herself relaxing into the warmth and casual chatter, but she made another crucial error when the server brought their drinks. "Could I see your wine list?" she asked automatically, the request slipping out before she could stop herself. The server, a college-aged young man with tired eyes and a name tag that read Kevin, looked at her with barely concealed amusement. "We've got beer and wine in bottles," he said. "Nothing fancy." "Of course," Vivienne said quickly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I'll just have the hot chocolate." But the damage was done. She caught Noah's expression, not angry, exactly, but thoughtful in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety. A woman who claimed to be between jobs and grateful for grocery money didn't casually request wine lists at family cafes, especially not in the tone of someone accustomed to sommelier recommendations and vintage years. Lily, oblivious to the undercurrents, launched into an enthusiastic description of her latest school project about the solar system, complete with hand gestures that nearly knocked over her hot chocolate. Vivienne found herself pulled into the conversation despite her growing anxiety, helping Lily work through the relative sizes of the planets and the concept of light years with a kind of patience she'd never known she possessed. "You're good with her," Noah observed as they walked through the downtown streets afterward, Lily skipping ahead to investigate shop windows that caught her interest. "She's easy to be good with," Vivienne replied. "She's curious about everything." "It's refreshing. Not many adults have that kind of patience with kids' questions. Most adults don't get the chance to remember what it's like to see the world that way." The words came out more wistfully than she'd intended, and she felt Noah's attention sharpen beside her. They were walking past expensive boutiques now, the kind of stores where Vivienne usually shopped without thinking about price tags or seasonal sales. Today, seeing them through Noah's eyes, she was struck by how insulated they seemed from real-life climate-controlled spaces where beautiful objects existed purely for the pleasure of those wealthy enough to afford them. Lily pressed her nose against the window of a toy store, her breath fogging the glass as she pointed out elaborate dollhouses and art sets that probably cost more than Noah made in a week. Vivienne felt a sharp pang of recognition, remembering her own childhood when she'd had access to everything money could buy, but it still felt somehow empty, somehow incomplete. "Dad, look at that snow globe collection," Lily called, and Vivienne's heart clenched as she saw what had caught the child's attention, a display of beautiful, intricate globes featuring scenes from around the world. "They're beautiful, kiddo," Noah said, but Vivienne could hear the careful tone of a parent who was mentally calculating prices and finding them far outside their budget. "The one I gave Miss Vivienne is better, though," Lily declared with the fierce loyalty of childhood, "because I picked it out especially for her." The simple statement hit Vivienne like a physical blow. The snow globe currently sitting on the windowsill of her hotel room, where she looked at it every morning and every night, had become precious to her, not because of its monetary value, which was minimal, but because it represented something she'd never experienced before: being chosen, being wanted, being included in someone else's definition of family. "Yes," she managed to say around the sudden tightness in her throat. "It's the most beautiful one I've ever seen." As they continued their walk, window shopping through neighborhoods that ranged from fashionable to modest, Vivienne found herself seeing the city through different eyes, not as a collection of investment opportunities or potential development sites, but as a place where people built lives from whatever materials they had available. She saw families like Noah and Lily's making the most of limited resources, finding joy in simple pleasures, creating wealth that couldn't be measured in bank statements or stock portfolios. But she also made more mistakes, small slips that accumulated like drops of water, eventually wearing away stone. She knew too much about art when they passed a gallery, recognized expensive brands without reading the labels, unconsciously corrected Lily's pronunciation of Renaissance with the authority of someone who'd had the best education money could. By the time they returned to the apartment building, Vivienne could see the questions accumulating behind Noah's eyes. He was too polite to ask directly, too kind to challenge her in front of Lily, but she could sense his growing certainty that nothing about her story quite added up. That evening, as they settled into their usual routine of homework and dinner preparation, Lily made another innocent observation that sent shivers down Vivienne's spine. "Miss Vivienne, you smell like my teacher's perfume," she said while they were working on a science project together. "The expensive kind, Mrs. Patterson. Says she only wears it on special occasions because it costs too much for every day." Vivienne began, then stopped. How could she explain wearing a perfume that cost more than most people's weekly groceries? How could she justify any of the small luxuries she'd taken for granted her entire life? "Maybe it's the same brand," she said weakly. "Maybe," Lily agreed cheerfully, already moving on to the next question about plant biology. But Noah was watching again, and this time Vivienne could see something that looked dangerously close to understanding beginning to dawn. In his expression, she was running out of innocent explanations, running out of ways to explain away the accumulating evidence that she was not who she claimed to be. And with each passing day, each shared meal and bedtime story and moment of domestic happiness, the stakes of that eventual revelation grew higher, because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Lily, who had begun including her in family prayers and asking when she was going to move in permanently. It was about Noah, who looked at her sometimes like she might be the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask. It was about a life she'd never imagined wanting, and was now terrified of losing. As Vivienne walked back to her hotel that night, the snow globe carefully wrapped in her purse, and the memory of the day's simple pleasures warming her despite the evening chill, she realized she was living on borrowed time. The truth would come out eventually. It always did. The question was whether she'd have the courage to tell it herself, or whether she'd wait for circumstances to force her hand. Either way, she was beginning to understand that the real risk wasn't in loving Noah and Lily. The real risk was in letting them love her back when she wasn't sure she deserved it. The newspaper landed on the hotel lobby's complimentary rack with the soft thud of routine distribution, its headlines screaming about budget cuts and political scandals and weather patterns that promised an early spring. Vivienne had developed the habit of scanning it over her morning coffee, part of her ongoing effort to understand how ordinary people consumed information about their world. Today, however, her blood turned to ice as she saw the headline buried in the business section: "Hale's missing. Billionaire's bizarre disappearance. Sparks Foundation crisis." Below it was a grainy photograph, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, showing her walking with Noah and Lily near Millennium Park. The image was blurry enough that her face wasn't entirely clear, but anyone who knew her would recognize the distinctive tilt of her head, the way she carried herself, even when she was trying to blend in. The article was brief but devastating. "Vivienne Hale, reclusive heir to the Hale Fortune Foundation, has been missing from her duties for over 2 weeks," sources close to the organization report. The mysterious disappearance has sparked concern among board members and raised questions about the leadership of one of Chicago's largest charitable organizations. Foundation spokesperson Charles Hale declined to comment on his niece's whereabouts, saying only that family matters are being handled privately. However, sources suggest that Ms. Hale was last seen leaving a foundation gala on the evening of February 14th and has not been in contact with her office since. The accompanying photograph, taken yesterday near downtown Chicago, shows a woman believed to be Miss C. Hale with unidentified companions. Vivienne's hands shook as she read the words that would destroy everything. It was only a matter of time, now hours, Maybe a day at most before, Marcus and the security team tracked down the photographer, identified the location, and followed the trail to Noah's apartment building. Her carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling. Like a house of cards in a hurricane dot, she was still staring at the newspaper when her phone rang. Marcus's name on the screen sent a spike of panic through her chest, but she answered on the third ring, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where are you?" he said without preamble. "Vivienne, please? Your uncle is threatening to have you declared incompetent. The board is in chaos. We need you to come in immediately." "I'm fine, Marcus," she said quietly. "I just needed some time to think." "Time to think? You've been missing for 2 weeks. Do you have any idea what's happening here? The Hartford merger is falling apart. The sustainability initiative is stalled. And Charles is making noises about assuming temporary guardianship of your assets." The words washed over her like static. The Hartford merger, the sustainability initiative, the complex machinery of inherited wealth and charitable obligation. All of it felt like echoes from someone else's life, problems that belonged to a woman she was no longer sure she wanted to. "I'll be in touch soon," she said, and hung up before Marcus could respond. But even as she tried to buy time, Vivienne knew she was fighting a losing battle. The photograph in the newspaper was just the beginning. By now, every private investigator and security firm in the city would be looking for her. The Foundation's resources were vast, and Charles would use every one of them to bring her back under control. She had perhaps hours before her two worlds collided in the most devastating way possible. Vivienne found herself walking toward Noah's building without conscious decision, drawn by a desperate need to see them one more time before everything fell apart. She knew she should stay away, should protect them from the storm that was coming. But the thought of disappearing without explanation, of leaving Lily to wonder what had happened to the woman she'd begun thinking of as family, was unbearable. She arrived to find Noah and Lily at the kitchen table, working on what appeared to be a diorama of the solar system for Lily's science project. They looked up when she entered, and the easy welcome in their faces made her heart break all over again. "Miss Vivienne," Lily called, bouncing up from her chair. "Perfect timing. Dad's trying to help me with Saturn's rings, but they keep falling off." "The engineering is more complicated than it looks," Noah said with a rueful smile, holding up a papier-match planet that was indeed shedding its cardboard rings like cosmic dandruff. For a moment, Vivienne allowed herself to pretend that this was her real life, that she belonged at this table, helping with homework and sharing in the simple domestic crises that made up a family's daily routine. She fixed Saturn's rings with steady hands and listened to Lily explain the difference between gas giants and terrestrial planets with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. But the fantasy couldn't last. Even as they worked, Vivienne could feel time running out like sand through an hourglass. Every minute that passed brought Marcus and the security team closer to finding her. Every laugh they shared would make the eventual revelation more painful for all of them. It was while they were cleaning up the craft supplies that disaster struck. The knock on the door was authoritative, unmistakably official. Noah glanced at Vivienne with mild curiosity. Neither of them was expecting visitors, but it was Lily, who ran to answer, her natural childhood assumption that visitors were always welcome. "Lily, wait," Noah began, but it was too late. The door opened to reveal Marcus, flanked by two men in expensive suits who could only be private security. Behind them, Vivienne could see additional figures in the hallway, a small army of people, whose job it was to locate missing billionaires and return them to their proper lives. "Miss Hale," Marcus said, his relief visible as he spotted her standing frozen beside the kitchen table. "Thank God. We've been looking everywhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Vivienne watched Noah's face as understanding dawned. Careful way he processed Marcus's words, the moment when all the accumulated inconsistencies suddenly made terrible sense. She saw recognition replace confusion, Then hurt replaced recognition. Then something that might have been betrayal settled over his features like a mask. "Miss Hale?" Lily repeated, looking between the adults with the confusion of a child who couldn't quite grasp what was happening. "But your name is Vivienne." "It is Vivienne," one of the security men said gently. "Vivienne Hale. She's a very important person, sweetheart, and a lot of people have been worried about her." "Important how?" Lily asked, but the question was directed at Vivienne. Her young face creased with the kind of bewilderment that came from having the familiar suddenly become foreign. "Lily," Noah said quietly, his voice carefully controlled, "why don't you go to your room for a few minutes while the adults talk?" "But Dad—" "Please, kiddo, just for a few minutes." Lily looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her father's tone must have warned her that this was not the time for negotiation. She disappeared down the hallway, but Vivienne suspected she would be listening from her doorway, trying to make sense of a situation that was beyond her understanding. "The Hale Foundation," Noah said once they were alone with Marcus and the security team. "You're Vivienne Hale. The Vivienne Hale." "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. "The billionaire, the heiress." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he was reading facts from a textbook rather than processing the destruction of everything he thought he knew about her. "Yes." Noah laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter sound of a man who just realized he'd been played for a fool. "Jesus Christ. This whole time, what was this to you? Some kind of social experiment? Slumming it with the working class?" "No," Vivienne said quickly, stepping toward him. "No, it wasn't like that. My feelings, everything between us that was real." "Real?" Noah's voice rose slightly, and he glanced toward Lily's room before bringing it back under control. "You've been lying to me about who you are from the moment we met. How could any of it be real?" "Because I wasn't pretending to feel what I felt," she said desperately. "I wasn't pretending to care about you and Lily. But you were pretending to be someone you're not. You were pretending to understand what it's like to struggle, to worry about rent, to have to choose between paying bills and buying groceries." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea how that feels? To find out that someone you trusted, someone you were falling in love with, was lying about everything?" The words hit Vivienne like physical blows. Falling in love with, past tense. Whatever they'd had, whatever fragile connection they'd built over shared meals and bedtime stories and quiet conversations about loss and hope, was already gone. She could see it dying in his eyes, killed by the weight of her deception. "Miss Hale," Marcus said gently, "we really do need to go. The board meeting is scheduled for. I know what I am." Vivienne snapped, her composure finally cracking. "I know what I have to go back to. But first I need—" She looked at Noah, seeing the careful distance he'd already put between them, the walls going up to protect himself and his daughter from further hurt. "I need you to know that I never meant for this to happen," she said quietly. "I never meant to fall in love with you. I never meant to hurt you or Lily." "But you did," Noah replied simply. "You did both." From down the hallway came the sound of a door opening, and Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with tears streaming down her face. She'd heard enough to understand that Vivienne was leaving, even if she didn't understand why. "You're going away," Lily said, her voice small and broken. "You're going back to your real life." "Lily, sweetheart," Vivienne began, but the child shook her head. "You were pretending," Lily said with the devastating clarity of childhood. "You were pretending to, like us." "No," Vivienne said, kneeling down to Lily's level. "I was never pretending about that. I love you. I love both of you. That was never pretending." "Then why are you leaving?" It was the simplest question in the world, and Vivienne had no answer that a 9-year-old would understand. How could she explain the weight of inherited responsibility, the complex machinery of wealth and power that had shaped her entire life? How could she make a child understand that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between different worlds? "I have to," she said finally, hating herself for the inadequacy of the response. Marcus cleared his throat gently. Miss Hale, Vivienne, stood, memorizing the sight of Noah and Lily in their small kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their ordinary life homework on the table. Dishes in the sink, the snow globe still sitting on the windowsill like a promise that had been broken. In a few hours, she would be back in her penthouse, back in boardrooms, back to the carefully managed existence she'd been born into. But she would never forget this kitchen, these people, this brief glimpse of what life could be when it was built on love rather than obligation. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt pitifully inadequate. "I'm so sorry." And then she was gone, escorted out of their lives by men in expensive suits, leaving behind only the memory of hot chocolate and board games, and the fairy tale belief that sometimes different worlds could find a way to coexist. Behind her, she could hear Lily crying, and Noah's voice, low and comforting, trying to explain the unexplainable. The sound followed her all the way to the waiting car, and she knew it would follow her much farther than that. She had found her family, and then destroyed it with her own cowardice. The fairy tale was over. The Hale Foundation's boardroom had never felt more like a mausoleum than it did during the emergency meeting 2 weeks after Vivienne's forced return. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, but the gray March sky seemed to press against the glass like a physical weight, matching the oppressive atmosphere inside the room where her future was being decided by people who saw her primarily as a signature on important documents. Uncle Charles sat at the head of the polished mahogany table with a satisfied air, a man who had finally gained the upper hand in a long-fought battle. The other board members, family friends, foundation trustees, and professional money managers who had been handling Hale interests for decades studied quarterly reports and asset statements with the dispassionate efficiency of people who dealt in numbers rather than human lives. "The Hartford merger cannot be delayed any longer," Charles was saying, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Vivienne's sabbatical has already cost us valuable time and credibility in the market." Vivienne sat in her designated chair, leather upholstered and positioned precisely 18 inches from the table, as if the board had calculated the exact distance required to maintain her involvement, while minimizing her influence, and tried to focus on the words that would determine her financial future. But her mind kept drifting to a small apartment across the city, where a 9-year-old girl was probably doing homework at a kitchen table, while her father worked a second job to pay rent that was overdue. "Vivienne?" Charles's voice cut through her reverie. "Did you hear the proposal?" "I heard it," she replied, though she couldn't have repeated the details if her life depended on it. Something about restructuring the foundation's investment portfolio, consolidating charitable giving under more centralized oversight, ensuring that future decisions would be made by committee rather than individual impulse. "And your response?" Vivienne looked around the table at faces that had been present at every major decision of her adult life, people who had managed her inheritance, arranged her education, choreographed her social obligations, and generally treated her as a valuable asset. That required careful stewardship rather than a human being with her own desires and dreams. "I need time to consider," she said finally. Charles's expression hardened. "Time is a luxury we can no longer afford. Your recent episode has raised serious questions about your fitness to manage such substantial assets independently." The word episode hung in the air like an insult, as if falling in love, as if discovering what it meant to be part of a real family, as if finding joy in simple domestic pleasures was a psychological breakdown rather than the most sane thing she'd done. In 30 years of carefully orchestrated existence, I wasn't aware that taking 2 weeks of personal time constituted grounds for questioning my competence, Vivienne said, her voice deliberately calm. "Personal time?" Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. You disappeared without notice, failed to attend crucial meetings, and were found living in conditions that suggest a complete break from reality. The photographs in the newspaper showed me having dinner with friends. Friends who had no idea who you actually were. Friends you were deceiving about your identity, your resources, your entire life. Charles leaned forward, his expression shifting to something that might have been concern if it hadn't been so obviously calculated. Vivienne, we understand that the pressures of your position can be overwhelming. That's why we're here to help you manage responsibilities that might be too much for any one person to handle alone. The condescension in his tone made her stomach clench with familiar frustration. This was the conversation they'd been building toward her entire adult life. The moment when her family would finally admit that they'd never trusted her to manage her own inheritance, that they saw her as a figurehead rather than a decision-maker, that her role was to look appropriate at galas and sign papers without asking too many questions about where the money actually went. I see, she said quietly. And what exactly are you proposing? A guardianship arrangement, one of the other board members said. Peterson. She thought, though she'd never been entirely clear on his actual role in the foundation's operations. Temporary, of course. Just until you've had time to recover from whatever stress caused this recent departure from your usual judgment. Guardianship. Vivienne tasted the word, finding it bitter. As in, someone else making decisions about my money, my life, my charitable giving. As in, Charles corrected smoothly, people with experience and objectivity, helping you make decisions that serve the foundation's best interests rather than personal whims. Personal whims. Is that what they thought Noah and Lily were? A momentary lapse in judgment. A rich girl's adventure in playing house with people who couldn't afford to be anything other than genuine? Vivienne stood abruptly, moving to the window where she could look down at the streets where real life happened. Somewhere out there, Noah was probably driving his rideshare routes, picking up passengers who needed to get from one place to another without thinking about the complex financial structures that made such simple transactions possible. Somewhere out there, Lily was probably asking her teacher questions about science or history with the kind of curiosity that money couldn't buy or suppress. And here, in this climate-controlled tower, people who had never wondered where their next meal was coming from were making decisions about charitable giving as if poverty was an abstract concept rather than the daily reality of families like Noah's. I want to propose an alternative, she said without turning around. Vivienne, Charles began, but she held up a hand. I want to establish a new initiative. Community transit hubs in underserved neighborhoods. Places where single parents can access affordable childcare, job placement services, transportation assistance, and educational resources. I want to start with a pilot program. Absolutely not. Charles's voice was sharp with finality. This is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making that concerns us. You've been missing for 2 weeks, and now you want to launch some kind of social experiment based on what? A temporary infatuation with people whose circumstances you couldn't possibly understand. I understand them better than you think. Do you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've confused charity work with real relationships. These people you've been living with, do you honestly believe they would have welcomed you so warmly if they'd known who you really were? The question hit exactly where Charles had intended it to, striking at the heart of her deepest fear. Would Noah have offered shelter to a billionaire heiress? Would Lily have been so eager to share her toys and homework time with someone who could buy and sell everything in their world without noticing the expense? But even as the doubt crept in, Vivienne remembered the way Noah had looked at her when she helped Lily with her science project, not with gratitude for charity received, but with the warm appreciation of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. She remembered Lily's casual assumption that love was something you shared freely, without calculation or condition. I think, she said carefully, that the people I met see beyond bank accounts to something you've apparently forgotten exists. They see human beings. Human beings who are now being harassed by tabloid photographers because of your selfish decision to involve them in your personal drama, Charles shot back. Have you seen today's papers? Have you considered what your little adventure has cost? Them? Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? Peterson slid a newspaper across the table, a different publication from the one that had first revealed her location, but with a headline that made her stomach drop toward her shoes. Mystery woman identified. Billionaire's secret romance shocks. Foundation World. Below, it was a much clearer photograph of Noah, obviously taken with a telephoto lens, as he walked Lily to school. The caption identified him by name, described his work as a rideshare driver, and speculated about whether he had known about Vivienne's wealth when their relationship began. The story has been picked up by 3 major networks, Charles continued, relentlessly. Your friend is being portrayed as everything from a gold digger to a con artist, depending on which version the readers prefer. His employer has received calls asking about his background. His daughter's school has had reporters asking questions about their family. Each word hit Vivienne like a physical blow. In her desperate desire to hold on to the happiness she'd found, she'd never considered that her identity would eventually become public knowledge, that Noah and Lily would be dragged into a media circus they'd never asked to join. She'd been thinking like a woman in love, rather than a public figure whose every move was potential tabloid fodder. I have to call him, she said, reaching for her phone. He's changed his number, Charles said quietly, as has his rideshare company. They've made it clear they want no further contact with you or anyone associated with the foundation. The words landed like a final blow. Of course, Noah would want to protect Lily from the media attention. Of course, he would see Vivienne's wealth not as an asset, but as a complication that threatened the quiet life he built for his daughter. Of course, he would choose his child's safety over a relationship with someone who had brought chaos into their carefully ordered world. But sitting in that boardroom, surrounded by people who saw her love as evidence of instability and her desire to help as dangerous idealism, Vivienne felt something crystallize inside her chest, a determination that surprised her with its fierce clarity. I'm still going to do it, she said. The Transit Hub project, the community initiative, all of it. With what money? Charles asked. If you refuse the guardianship arrangement, we'll have no choice but to petition the court for involuntary commitment. My recent behavior suggests that I've finally figured out what our money should actually be used for. Vivienne interrupted. And if you try to have me committed for wanting to help single parents find stable employment and childcare, I'll make sure every newspaper in the city knows exactly what kind of charitable foundation we're really running. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Charles's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade that suggested he was reconsidering his approach. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Vivienne turned back to the window, looking down at the city where somewhere a man she loved was trying to rebuild a life she'd accidentally destroyed, where a little girl was probably wondering why the woman she'd trusted had turned out to be someone else entirely. I'm proposing, she said, that we start acting like the charitable organization we claim to be, and I'm proposing that I'm going to do it with or without your approval. It was time to find out whether love could be rebuilt from the ashes of deception, whether bridges could be built across the gap between worlds that had never been meant to intersect. It was time to discover if a fairy tale could have a second chance at a happy ending. The letter arrived at the Hale Foundation on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a postal worker who had no idea. He was carrying a small piece of someone's heart across the city. Marcus found it in the stack of daily correspondence, the careful block letters on the envelope immediately recognizable as the work of someone young enough to still believe that the right words could fix anything. Miss Vivienne Hale, the envelope read, with the return address listed simply as Lily P. Marcus had seen enough mail over the years to recognize fan letters, complaints, and various requests for charitable giving. But something about this particular envelope, the careful way the stamps had been placed, the obvious effort that had gone into making the handwriting as neat as possible, made him pause before adding it to the general pile. Inside Vivienne's office, she was mechanically reviewing architectural plans for the community transit hub that Charles had grudgingly agreed to fund, though with enough restrictions and oversight to ensure she understood who was really in charge. The blueprints showed a beautiful, functional space where families could access childcare, job training, and transportation assistance. But every line on the page reminded her of the people she'd originally intended to help, people who now wanted nothing to do with her. "This came for you," Marcus said, placing the envelope on her desk with unusual care. "Personal delivery." Vivienne looked up from the plans, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope, revealing two pieces of paper, a letter written in careful crayon, and a drawing that made her breath catch in her throat. The drawing was a new family portrait, 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with Lily plus Dad plus Miss Vivienne written at the bottom in purple marker. But this time, instead of an empty space, the third figure was clearly meant to be here, complete with what looked like a crown and a big smile. The letter was brief, written with the earnest sincerity that only children could achieve. "Dear Miss Vivienne, Dad is sad and won't tell me why, but I know it's because you went away. Mrs. Rodriguez says sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that doesn't mean they don't love each other. I made mistakes too, like when I broke Dad's favorite mug, but he still loves me. We miss you and forgive you. Dad doesn't know I'm writing this, but I think he misses you too, because he keeps looking at your snow globe and getting the sad face he used to get when he looked at Mom's pictures. Can you please come home? We have your snow globe and it's waiting for you. Love, Lily. P.S. I asked Mrs. Rodriguez how to spell forgive." Vivienne read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision as Lily's words cut through weeks of self-doubt and boardroom politics with the surgical precision of absolute truth. A 9-year-old child had done what teams of lawyers and financial advisors couldn't. She'd shown Vivienne exactly what mattered and exactly what she was in danger of losing forever. "Marcus," she said, her voice rough with emotion, "clear my calendar for the rest of the day. You have the Hartford meeting at 3. Cancel it. Cancel everything." Vivienne stood, grabbing her coat with sudden purpose. "And call a press conference for this evening. Send notices to every major media outlet in the city." "What should I tell them it's about?" Vivienne looked down at Lily's drawing, at the 3 figures holding hands under their rainbow, and felt something settle into place in her chest, a certainty she'd been searching for her entire adult life. Tell them it's about the future of the Hale Foundation. Tell them it's about what charity really means. And tell them, she paused, thinking about a little girl brave enough to write letters to billionaires, about a man who'd offered shelter without asking for anything in return, about the family she'd found and lost and was determined to find again. Tell them it's about love. The press conference was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the Foundation's main lobby, but word had leaked early enough that reporters began gathering by 4. Vivienne watched from her office window as news vans lined the street below, their satellite dishes pointed toward the building like technological sunflowers following the promise of a story. Charles appeared in her doorway at 5:30, his face grim with the particular expression he wore when family scandals threatened to become public. "Spectacles. Whatever you're planning," he said without preamble, "I strongly advise you to reconsider. The Foundation's reputation has been built on keeping charitable giving at arm's length," Vivienne interrupted, "on making sure we never get too close to the people we're supposed to be helping, on treating poverty like a problem that can be solved with quarterly donations and tax-deductible galas. That approach has served the Foundation well for 3 generations. It served the Foundation's board well, Vivienne corrected. I'm not sure it served anyone else. At 5 minutes to 6, she made her way to the lobby, where cameras and microphones had transformed the elegant space into something resembling a news studio. Marcus had prepared a podium with the Foundation's logo, but Vivienne moved past it to stand directly in front of the gathered reporters with only Lily's letter in her hands. 3 weeks ago, she began, I walked away from a Foundation gala because I realized I had never actually met any of the people our money was supposed to help. I spent 2 weeks living as someone else, getting to know a family who taught me more about generosity and love than I'd learned in 30 years of charitable giving. The cameras flashed and clicked like a mechanical symphony, but Vivienne kept her eyes focused on the back of the room, imagining Noah and Lily watching somewhere, hoping they would understand what she was trying to do. I fell in love, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I fell in love with a man who offered shelter to a stranger in a storm. I fell in love with his daughter, who shared her toys and her hot chocolate and her hope for the future without asking what I could give her in return. And I fell in love with the idea that wealth should be measured not in bank accounts, but in the connections we make with each other. A reporter near the front raised her hand. Miss Hale, are you confirming the rumors about your relationship with? Confirming, Vivienne said, cutting her off, that I've learned what our Foundation should actually be doing. Starting immediately, we'll be establishing community transit hubs in underserved neighborhoods, places where single parents can access childcare, job training, and transportation assistance. Not as charity, but as investment in families who are already doing the hard work of building better lives. The questions came fast after that, a barrage of inquiries about funding and logistics, and whether this represented a fundamental shift in the Foundation's mission. But Vivienne answered them all with the steady confidence of someone who had finally figured out what she was fighting for. The first hub will open in 6 months, she concluded, in a renovated depot on the south side. It will be staffed by people from the community it serves, because no one understands the needs of working families better than working families themselves. As the reporters dispersed and the cameras packed up, Vivienne felt the exhaustion of someone who had just declared war on everything she'd been raised to accept. But she also felt something else, a lightness that came from finally telling the truth, from choosing love over fear, from deciding that some things were worth fighting for, even if you weren't sure you could win. Now came the harder part, finding out if Noah and Lily would give her the chance to prove that fairy tales could have second chances, and that sometimes the princess needed to save herself before she could save anyone else. The snow globe sat on her desk, or she'd placed it after the press conference, its miniature world contained and perfect, and patiently waiting for someone to pick it up and give it another shake dot, just like love, she thought. Just like hope got, just like the family she was determined to win back. Noah was halfway through his evening shift when he saw the news alert on his phone. Hale heiress announces major Foundation changes, confirms romance rumors. The notification sat at the top of his screen like an accusation, daring him to click on something he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. He'd been doing his best to pretend Vivienne Hale didn't exist, to focus on the immediate necessities of keeping himself and Lily afloat in the aftermath of what the tabloids had dubbed Chicago's most unlikely romance. The media attention had been brutal, but brief. A few days of photographers outside their building, phone calls from reporters wanting to know if he'd known about Vivienne's wealth, speculation about his motivations that made him feel sick to his stomach. The worst part hadn't been the invasion of privacy, or even the loss of his rideshare job, when the company decided he'd become too much of a distraction. The worst part had been explaining to Lily why the woman she'd begun thinking of as family had turned out to be someone else entirely. Why people with money sometimes pretended to be different than they were. Why grown-ups made things so complicated when love should be simple. But now, sitting in his replacement car, a newer model, He'd managed to lease with help from Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew, who worked at a dealership. Noah found himself staring at that news alert and remembering the way Vivienne had looked when Lily showed her the family portrait. The way she'd listened to bedtime stories with the attention of someone who'd never experienced that particular ritual. The way she'd cried when Lily had given her the snow globe, as if she'd never received a gift chosen with love rather than obligation. Against his better judgment, he clicked the link. The video showed Vivienne standing in what looked like the lobby of an expensive building, facing a crowd of reporters with the kind of composed confidence that came from a lifetime of public appearances. But there was something different about her expression, a vulnerability he recognized from their quiet evenings around his kitchen table. "I fell in love," she was saying to the cameras, "with a man who offered shelter to a stranger in a storm. I fell in love with his daughter, who shared her toys and her hot chocolate and her hope for the future without asking what I could give her in return." Noah pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he watched the woman he'd tried so hard to forget publicly declaring her feelings to a room full of strangers. This wasn't the careful, measured philanthropy he'd expected from someone of her background. This was raw, honest, and completely at odds with the image of calculated deception he'd been carrying for weeks. The video continued with Vivienne announcing some kind of community initiative transit hubs, she called them. Places where single parents could access childcare and job training. She talked about investment rather than charity, about understanding rather than pity, about building connections rather than maintaining distance. It sounded exactly like something the woman he'd fallen in love with would say. By the time he got home, Noah was emotionally exhausted and more confused than he'd been since the day Marcus had appeared at his door. Lily was already in her pajamas, sitting at the kitchen table with homework spread in front of her, but she looked up when he entered with the particular expression she wore when she had something important to discuss. "I saw her on TV," she said. Without preamble, Lily, she was talking about us. About how we shared hot chocolate and toys and hope. Lily's voice carried the precise cadence of someone who had memorized words that mattered to her. She said she fell in love with our family. Noah sat down across from his daughter, studying her face for signs of the confusion and hurt that had defined the past few weeks. Instead, he found something that looked suspiciously like determination. "She also said she learned about generosity from us," Lily continued. "But Dad, we learned about generosity from her too. Remember how she helped with my homework even though she didn't have to? Remember how she fixed Saturn's rings when they kept falling off? That's different, kiddo." How? A simple question hit him with the force of childhood logic that cut through adult complications like a sword through silk. How was it different? Because Vivienne had money and they didn't? Because she'd lied about her identity? Because she'd brought chaos into their carefully ordered life? Or because he was scared that loving someone meant risking the kind of loss he'd already survived once and wasn't sure he could survive again? "She lied to us," Noah said finally. "She lied about her name and her job," Lily corrected with 9-year-old precision. "She didn't lie about liking us. She didn't lie about wanting to be part of our family. You can see it in her face, Dad. The same way Mom never lied about loving us, even when she was too sick to say it." The comparison to Sarah hit Noah like a physical blow, but not because it was unfair, because it was exactly right. Sarah had been many things: teacher, volunteer, optimist, dreamer, but above all, she'd been someone who believed in love as a choice rather than a feeling, as something you did rather than something that happened to you. And if Sarah were here now, she would probably tell him to stop being an idiot and go get the woman who loved their daughter, enough to publicly announce it to the entire city. "Besides," Lily added, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her backpack, "I already wrote her a letter. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me mail it yesterday." Noah stared at his daughter, realizing that while he'd been nursing his wounded pride and trying To protect them both from further hurt, Lily had been doing what she'd always done, reaching out with a generous spirit that had made their small family a haven for anyone lucky enough to find them. "What did the letter say?" he asked. "That we miss her, and forgive her, and want her to come home," Lily replied matter-of-factly. "And that love means making mistakes sometimes, but trying to fix them when you do." 9 years old, Noah thought, and already wiser than most adults he knew, including, apparently, himself. "Do you think she'll come?" Lily asked. Noah looked at his daughter Sarah's eyes, Sarah's stubborn chin, Sarah's generous heart, wrapped in a package that somehow managed to be both completely vulnerable and absolutely fearless, and realized that courage, like love, might be something you chose rather than something you felt. "I don't know, kiddo," he said honestly, "but maybe it's time we found out." 6 months later, the Roosevelt Road Community Transit Hub opened on a Tuesday morning that sparkled with the particular promise of early autumn in Chicago. The former depot had been transformed into something that managed to be both functional and beautiful, spaces for childcare and job training flowing seamlessly into areas for community meetings and family services, all designed with the input of the people who would actually use them. Vivienne stood near the main entrance, watching as families explored the facility with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope that came from being offered something that seemed too good to be true. Children ran between the bright play areas, while their parents talked quietly with staff members about employment opportunities and educational programs. It was everything she'd envisioned during those long nights of planning and fighting with the foundation board. Everything she'd hoped for when she'd decided that love was worth fighting for, even when you weren't sure you could win. But the person she most wanted to see hadn't arrived yet, and with each passing hour, Vivienne found herself wondering if courage had limits, if some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, no matter how much you wanted to cross them. She was helping a group of children with an art project when she heard Lily's voice cutting through the general din of opening day excitement. "Miss Vivienne, we came." "We really came." Vivienne turned to find Lily running toward her with the kind of pure joy that made everything else in the world temporarily unimportant. Behind her, moving more slowly, but with a smile that made Vivienne's chest tight with hope, came Noah. Looked good, better than she'd dared hope during the months of careful distance they'd maintained, while lawyers and architects and community organizers worked to make her vision reality. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had found stable ground after months of uncertainty. "Lily," Vivienne said, kneeling down to catch the child in a hug that felt like coming home after a long journey. "I'm so glad you're here. What do you think?" "It's perfect," Lily declared with the definitive authority of someone who had never learned to qualify her enthusiasm. "Dad, look at the art room, and they have computers. And Mrs. Rodriguez says they're going to have cooking classes." "It's impressive," Noah said, and Vivienne felt a warmth in his voice that she hadn't dared hope for. "Really impressive." "You did this?" "We did this," Vivienne corrected. "All of us. The community, the foundation, everyone who believed it was possible to do better." They walked through the facility together, Lily running ahead to investigate everything, while Noah and Hal. Vivienne followed at a more sedate pace. It felt natural in a way that surprised them both, as if the months of separation had been a necessary pause rather than an ending, a chance for both of them to figure out who they were individually before they could discover who they might be together. "I got your letter," Vivienne said, as they watched Lily make friends with a group of children in the play area. "Lily's letter, I mean. It came at exactly the right moment." "She's good at that," Noah replied, "knowing what people need to hear and when they need to hear it. She gets that from her father." "She gets that from her mother," Noah corrected. Gently. Sarah always said that love was something you had to practice, like playing piano or riding a bike. Something you got better at the more you did it. They found themselves in the childcare area, where comfortable seating and educational toys created the kind of space where working parents could leave their children without worry. Vivienne had spent months researching the best practices, visiting other facilities, talking to single parents about what they actually needed rather than what she thought they might want. "I should have told you," she said finally, the words she'd been practicing for months finally finding their way out. "From the beginning, I should have trusted you with the truth." "Maybe," Noah agreed, "but I understand why you didn't. In your world, people probably want things from you all the time. Money, connections, access to opportunities they can't get any other way. That's not an excuse for lying to you, for lying to Lily." "No," Noah said, "but it's an explanation. And sometimes understanding why people do things is more important than whether they were right to do them." Lily appeared beside them with a sudden materialization that children had perfected, tugging on Vivienne's hand with urgent purpose. "Miss Vivienne, I have something for you," she announced, producing a carefully wrapped package from her backpack. "Dad helped me make it." Inside the wrapping paper was a new snow globe clearly handmade, with a miniature scene that took Vivienne's breath away. 3 small figures stood in front of a tiny building that was unmistakably the transit hub, surrounded by trees and benches, and the suggestion of a community that cared for its own. "It's our new family portrait," Lily explained seriously. "Dad says we get to choose our family, not just the one we're born with, and we choose you if you want to be chosen." Vivienne looked at Noah, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and vulnerability she felt in her own chest. They'd both learned something in the months apart, that love wasn't just about feeling, but about choosing, about building something together that was stronger than either of them could create alone. "I want to be chosen," she said quietly. "I want to choose both of you, every day, for as long as you'll have me." The wedding 6 months later was small by foundation standards, but perfect by every measure that mattered. They held it in the transit hub's community room, surrounded by the families who had become their extended community and the friends who had helped them understand that home wasn't a place, but a decision, a daily choice to build something beautiful together. Lily served as both flower girl and ring bearer, a dual role she took seriously enough to practice for weeks. Mrs. Rodriguez catered with the kind of food that made people feel loved rather than impressed. And when the judge asked if they had anything special to say to each other, Vivienne and Noah simply repeated the words that had brought them together in the first place. "You're coming with me," they said in unison. And this time it wasn't about shelter from a storm, but about shelter for a lifetime, about building a family one act of kindness at a time. A snow globe sat on the mantel of their new home, larger than Noah's old apartment, but still filled with the same warmth that had drawn Vivienne in from the cold, and every morning Lily would give it a shake before breakfast, watching the snow settle around their 3 small figures and the community they'd helped build together. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories did begin with the simplest acts of kindness. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, they lasted forever.